Hey Nina, so I'm going to show you how to export a file for 3D printing. I'm going to show you two different ways. The first way is how to do it if your active point count isn't ridiculously high, and the second way will be to show you how to do it if your active point count is a lot higher than 1 or 2 million. Okay, so if your active point count is 1 million or 2 million, we can use a straight up decimation preset. So decimation is found under zplugin. If you open up zplugin and go to Decimation Master, at the bottom you have these presets, and this is a target point count. Okay, so at the moment our surface is lots of quads. It's probably a Dynamesh surface. Yeah. To reduce the file size, we're going to turn these quads into triangles, and that process is called decimation. Okay, so I just pressed F to zoom out. So if I go zplugin, decimation, and then I'm going to go for whatever, if I'm dropping from like 1 million or 2 million, I might go for the slightly higher preset, because the dropping from 1 or 2 million down is relatively heavy on your computer. So let's go for 250, press it once. You'll see that there's like a kind of progress thing happening at the top. Decimation can take a while, it can take a few minutes, depending on your active point count and depending on the RAM or processor in your computer. Okay, so you just have to be patient. Try not to click or try to scale or zoom or anything whilst the decimation is being performed, because it does have a tendency to crash the computer if you do that. So I'm just waiting for this computing kind of progress thing to finish, and at that point this number will also drop down the 2.2 million. There we go, it's now 250,000. If we switch on polyframe and zoom in, you can see now that the surface, which before, if I go back one step, was a quad Dynamesh surface, 2.2 million, it's now a triangulated decimated surface of 250,000 points. However, to the eye, without polyframe mode, if you look at this surface, the difference between a decimated surface and a Dynamesh surface is pretty unnoticeable. So jumping from 2.2 million to 250,000 hasn't really affected the quality of the surface. Especially for a 3D print, that would definitely not be noticeable to the naked eye, even if you were printing in resin. Okay, so that's the kind of quickest way to reduce the surface. And I'll just explain exporting quickly, in case that kind of worked for you. If you have a really high active point count, I will explain how to reduce that, but I'll just talk about scaling and exporting first. So we're at 250. We could actually, if you wanted to, drop this down or try dropping this down even further. You again would just go to zplugin, and instead of pressing 250, would press 150. And I guess you could just go as low as you want, as long as the surface quality doesn't change too much. So the difference between 250 and 150 to me also isn't very noticeable. And what this means is that your file size, as you drop down, will become smaller and smaller. So again, you could even drop down to 75, press it once. I'm noticing a slight surface change. For me personally, because I know this is going to be printed quite large, I would maybe just go back to 150, because it's also still going to be a very, very small file. It's going to probably be less than 20 megabytes. So rather than trying to push it super down, I would probably just keep it at 150. Okay. Still looking good, and the surface is these triangles. To export it, to scale it and export it, we'd go to zplugin, close the Decimation Master menu, and instead open the 3D Print Hub menu. Then what you're going to do is go to your size scale, and I've actually already scaled this to 300 mil, but let's pretend that it hadn't been scaled yet, so it's kind of like at a random dimension. If it's at a random dimension, what you need to do is scale on one axis. So I know, for example, that you want to print this at 30 centimeters, and that's going to be the distance from the tip of the tail to the end of the beak, and that's going to be my z-axis, because I know that my other dimensions are nowhere near as big as that. Okay, so under zplugin, I go to Z, and then I manually type in 300, which is 300 millimeters, press enter. Okay, and then that's the scale that it will be exported at. Again, under zplugin, we go to, let's just have Subtool open, go to zplugin, export options, and we want it to be on selected. That means it will only export the selected subtools. So let's imagine you had like a couple of pigeons in here, or 3 pigeons in here. If you had all, it will export all of those individual subtools. If you had visible, it would export whichever ones had the eyeball switched on. If you do selected, it will only export whichever subtool you're actually sitting in. Yeah. Down here, there shouldn't really be anything you need to change. You don't have texture and you don't have polypaint. If these are switched on, you could just switch them off, but you don't have either of those things at the moment. You then just need to pick your format. So generally for 3D printing, we're going for STL or OBJ. I'll click OBJ. I'm then going to save the pigeon. I actually saved it before, but I'll just overwrite that file. Press save. And that's that. And we can see if I just open that thing again, we can take a look at the file size. When you save, it will create an OBJ, which is this file, and then it will also create a .mtl file. You don't really need the mtl file, you can actually just get rid of that. The OBJ that we just exported, it's like just over 10 megabytes, so this is a great size for emailing to the print bureau, and yeah, pretty small. Okay, so now I'm going to show you the other method, and that is what you'd use if, let's take this all the way back to being a Dynamesh. Let's get rid of these guys. So let's say, for example, you don't have 2.2 million points. Let's divide it a couple of times. Let's say you've got 8 million, yeah? And you haven't got any subdivisions that you can drop down to. So let's say you've finished your sculpt, and you should only ever do decimation once you've completely finished. So once all your details have been added and you've like flattened off the bottom if you want it to stand, all that sort of stuff, only decimate once you're completely ready to export. So let's say you're at 8 million, you don't even necessarily have Dynamesh on, but you know, for example, that this is a, you know, watertight mesh, there's no funny business inside, so you're kind of ready to export it, but you've got a super high active point count. If you go to zplugin, decimation, and you try to jump from 8 million points down to 250, chances are your computer is going to crash. It's too much of a drop, it's too much processing for the computer to do in one go, unless you've got like a decent processor and a decent amount of RAM. It's probably going to crash. So in this case, what we're going to do is a 2-stage decimation. So we're going to ignore the presets, and instead we're going to use this, which is the pre-processing and then the actual decimation. Okay. If you have multiple subtools, you would maybe be pressing pre-process all. If you're just working with one subtool, or you only want to decimate one subtool, then you're going to be pressing pre-process current. Me personally, even if I need to decimate 5 different subtools, sorry, I always do one by one, because I tend to find no matter how good your computer is, if you try to decimate high density subtools all at the same time, you're kind of going to crash. So I would say always just process one at a time. Let's just go with the basic setting. 20% means it's going to try and reduce 8 million down to 20% of that figure. So probably around, I don't know, just under 2 million active points. That is still quite a jump. You could change that to like 50%, and then what it will do is try to drop down from 8 to 4 million. So depending on how powerful your computer is, you might want to change that 20% up and do it a couple of times. I've got a pretty good computer, so I'm going to just stick to 20%, right? So then I'm going to do pre-process current. Keep in mind, this is a relatively heavy process. So this first stage of computing the decimation can take a while. It can even take like 5 minutes. Make sure that you don't like try to click or spin or zoom in on your document whilst this is processing. It will probably crash, yeah? Let it do its thing, you know, go grab a glass of water, whatever it is you want to do. Don't try and interact with the screen, okay? So I'm just going to wait for mine to process. Okay, cool. So that pre-processing just finished. I actually paused the recording. I think it took about 4 minutes for it to pre-process. Now what I do is go back into Decimation and I press Decimate Current. And it will actually run the decimation now. Oh yeah, there we go. We can see it's now dropped down to 1.7 million. Okay, so we now have, same as before, we've switched from quads over to triangles. Now this is still a high active point count, even though it's a triangulated decimated mesh. It's still a high active point count. Okay, so what you can now do is perform another decimation, and depending on what this number is, if this was like 3 million or 4 million, I would perform another pre-process and then decimate and maybe just change this to like 50%. But because this is now relatively low, I'm just going to go for a preset now. So I'll just press 250, it's dropped, and then maybe down to 150. Okay, and this 150, if we actually zoom in a little bit, let's move over to, like, let's say the head. So that 150, which is this triangulated surface, and the original 8 million, there's no actual visible difference, okay, only when you switch on wireframe, yeah, or polyframe. So you're just reducing, retaining your quality level, but switching over from those nice sculptable quads to the more simplified triangles. You don't want to sculpt anymore once you have a triangulated surface, okay, because it will just warp horribly. Then, same as before, zplugin, 3D Print Hub, make sure your scale's okay, make sure you've got selected on, and then export to OBJ. Cool, if you have any issues, let me know. If your computer has a tendency to crash while you're trying to decimate, you could always just send me the file and I can do it for you. Yeah, let me know how you get on.